Now, what's interesting about both of these movements is that they realize that the Islamic vision of life had to be renewed, and that it required a new direct contact with the Book of Allah, and for the vision of life based upon the Book of Allah and taking into account the circumstances in which the Muslims were now living, for that vision to be crystallized and put out there for anybody who could read, basically, that was essential for Islamizing the viewpoint of your basic educated citizen. And so the two individuals who produced these, what are probably, without a doubt, the most influential tafsirs of the 20th century, the two individuals who produced those tafsirs did not have an educational background of madrasa training. Both of them actually, professionally, they started out as journalists. Maududi, his father died when he was 16. His father had been a lawyer who had been in some way associated with Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who was the great modernist Muslim leader who founded Aligarh University. His father was originally from Delhi, but he moved his family down to Hyderabad, which was the real heartland of Muslim intellectual activity and culture in India. And he had this strong consciousness that he didn't want his son, I don't know if he had other children beside, but he didn't want his children, let's say, ruined by exposure to British education. And anybody who's educated in the Indian subcontinent knows that virtually all of the Western style education that was available for pretty much 150 years in India was provided by Christian religious orders. And the people who were produced by that educational system, they had basically either completely abandoned the Islamic outlook, or they were very apologetic, and they had all kinds of inferiority complex. So Maududi's father basically educated him at home. And briefly, he had some exposure to madrasa education at a high school level, but not for very long. And then, so I'm not sure, in my reading I didn't come across the details of how Maududi was educated. Did his father bring in tutors, or did he personally educate him? I would guess that he did it at least with some outside help. Anyway, when Maududi was 16, his father died. And so he began trying to earn a living for himself. And he started out as a journalist. And he was working for a newspaper or magazine that was the sort of the official voice of the Association of Indian Ulama. And he was associated with that for something like 10 years. And if we look at Sayyid Qutb in Egypt, he went to a government school, Darul Uloom. He got out and became a teacher, and then after some years, he became a functionary in the education ministry. And during that time, he was putting out writing. He wrote some novels. He wrote works of literary criticism, some literary theory, and then he was sent to America for about 2 years. He spent about 2 years. The education ministry sent him there to find out, to learn techniques related to that field of specialization, education. And as a young man, Sayyid Qutb had been influenced by people that were very impressed by the West. And his eyewitness of American culture completely flipped him around. I don't know to what extent he had already moved away from that, but by the time he came back from America around 1951, 50, something like that, by the time he came back, he had a very negative view of Western civilization. And some scholars have speculated that one of the things that really turned him off was seeing how racist American society was, because Egyptian people come in a spectrum of skin colors. And Sayyid Qutb, being from Upper Egypt, which is actually in the south, he was from a village somewhere in the general vicinity of Asyut. And the people there tend to be darker skinned. So at that time, America was an apartheid state. And so people with dark skin would very likely have been constantly reminded of racist attitudes in the people that they came into contact with. Just an example of that, of this casual racism. I remember reading a biography of Jamal Abdel Nasser, and he was one of the founders of the non-aligned movement, along with Tito and Nehru and Sukarno. And so the founding session of that movement was in Bandung, Indonesia. And the State Department and CIA, forget which one, I mean, they both had an interest in that conference, and they looked at it with suspicion and distrust. And their nickname for the conference was the Darktown Strutters Ball. So that attitude, that was probably around late 50s that the Bandung conference was held, and Sayyid Qutb was in America probably at the very end of the 40s. So the likelihood that he encountered that kind of racism in America is probably strong. Another thing that disturbed him a lot was seeing churches being used for dancing and intimacy, with men and women and just playing pop tunes. He couldn't fathom that, and he really reacted strongly against it. Anyway, let's go back to Maududi. So the fact was that his Islamic education was basically what they call autodidactism. He was self-taught. And eventually that got him into a lot of, there was a lot of hostility to him on the part of the traditional ulama. And they were, one gets a sense almost that they were looking for reasons to criticize him. And we'll get into some of those criticisms later. He was the editor of the official organ of the Jam'iyyat Ulama al-Hind from 1924 to 1927. In 1932, he became the editor of a monthly journal called Tarjuman al-Qur'an. In August 1941, he founded Jamaat Islami. And from the start, Jamaat Islami was always a sort of it was an elitist organization. They never really penetrated the masses. Their focus was always on the educated, and those were the people, middle-class educated people was the people that tended to join them. The highest strata of landowner class tended to be very secularized. And so you have this educated middle-class people who aren't that rich. They were the core membership. And their influence upon the uneducated was negligible. And when Pakistan was created, the talk was starting to go on that the Muslims need their own state, and those who were pushing for it, like Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the people around him, they saw it completely in terms of the Muslims are a group and we need a state, and that state will of course be secular and nationalist. And Maududi started putting out writings to say this state, it has no justification for existence unless it's Islamic. And when the state of Pakistan was formed, he moved to Pakistan, and his organization and the pressure that they exerted had a very large influence on pushing Pakistan towards acknowledgement that it should be an Islamic state. There was some kind of a meeting in the early to mid 50s where Maududi and his like-minded people and the traditional ulama, they had this conference where they produced a document saying, identifying some 22 points more or less of what would the features of a truly Islamic state be, and that then became some kind of a basis for developing a constitution that would reflect that. And also something that was quite important in the 50s, a lot of the people that were in the higher echelons of power in Pakistan were Ahmadis, and Maududi sort of led the criticism of this group that their ideas were so heterodox, heretical, that they couldn't really be called Muslims at all. So he kept pushing for that, and as a result, he was jailed and sentenced to death. But eventually, the sentence was never carried out. It must have been commuted, and he was released after a couple of years in jail. His last period of jailing was 1955. And then after that, he traveled extensively, and he helped establish the Islamic University of Medina, and had input on how it should be designed, its curriculum. And he also had a role in the establishment of the Muslim World League that's based in Mecca. And his writings are voluminous. He put out more than 130 works in a variety of topics, all with an Islamic focus: history, philosophy, sociology, law, and most significantly, his most important work is considered to be TAFSIIR al-Qur'an, which is his translation of the Qur'an. And many of his works have been translated into something like a dozen different languages. And it took him 30 years to finish TAFSIIR al-Qur'an. He started in the late 40s, and He finished it in 1973. And his vision is that sovereignty belongs to Allah, and that people have gone astray. And one of the things that's key and critical to his whole philosophy, he has a small book that apparently was associated in some way as an introduction to his tafsir, or a companion to his tafsir. It's called Four Quranic Terms, in which he discusses the linguistic meaning and then the Sharia meanings of Rabb, Ilah, Ibadah, and Deen, if I remember correctly. And so the whole focus on that is that for people to have the deen that Allah wants from them, then deen has to be much more than just going through religious rituals. That it has to rule every aspect of people's lives. And that when that doesn't happen, then a culture becomes jahili. And jahiliyyah is not just the pre-Islamic period of Arabian society. It's any society in which the philosophy is not derived from revelation. And that the goal or the responsibility of human beings is to establish Allah's will upon the earth. That they have people have an individual task, and then they have a general collective task. And that collective task is to establish a society that is run according to Allah's will. And that this should be a participatory process, that government should have public input, and that the Sharia should be the point of reference, and that the leader should be elected by whatever means are appropriate, providing that they ensure that the man who enjoys the greatest measure of national confidence is chosen, and that there should be some kind of a legislator that's also chosen by any means, as long as the people are those who have the confidence of the population at large.